People who confuse excitement with value usually learn the truth in two stages. First, they leave the person who made life stable, because stability has stopped flattering them. Then they discover that the person they chose for intensity was never built for loyalty, only for contrast. That is one of the more predictable tragedies in adult relationships. But what makes it painful is not the predictability. It is the arrogance required to misread two people so badly at once. To look at the spouse who carried the weight of real life and call him ordinary. Then look at the person offering borrowed glamour and call him freedom. By the time the illusion breaks, the real lesson is no longer about romance. It is about judgment. That was the lesson my wife learned too late. It was also the lesson I had to learn about myself, because for too many years I believed steadiness explained itself. I thought if a man stayed responsible, emotionally restrained, and useful in all the ordinary places where life actually has to be maintained, then the people closest to him would understand what they were standing next to. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means it survives longer than it should. I believed that because I was not theatrical, I would be hard to underestimate. In reality, quiet men are underestimated all the time. We get translated into background, into routine, into infrastructure. And once someone begins seeing you as infrastructure instead of character, they start imagining that leaving you means leaving limitation behind rather than leaving reality. My name is Nathaniel Reed. I'm 48 years old, and until a little under 2 years ago I had been married for 16 years to a woman named Allison. We lived outside Dallas in one of those neighborhoods built for the appearance of settled success. Large kitchens, clean garages, school district bragging rights, and front porches that looked much calmer from the street than the lives inside them actually were. We had 2 children, a daughter already in college and a son in high school. I worked in commercial risk and financial controls for a medical distribution firm, which meant contracts, compliance, vendor exposure, timing, and all the quiet disciplines that prevent confident people from making expensive mistakes. I liked that work because it punished fantasy eventually. You could perform intelligence in a meeting, but you still had to respect the numbers, the timing, the sequence, and the consequences. Reality, in that world, had rules. It did not care who sounded most alive in the room. At home, I was slower than I should have been to apply the same standard. Allison worked in luxury residential design consulting. She was bright, attractive, socially graceful, and very good at making other people feel slightly more elegant for being near her. When we met, I found that magnetic. I was steadier, more inward, less interested in the theater of social ease. She felt vivid in ways I wasn't trying to be. I made life more secure. She made it feel warmer. In the beginning, that was not a lie. It really was a balance. I do not want to rewrite the early years into fraud simply because the later ones became humiliating. There was real love in our marriage. Real loyalty for a long time. We built a house, buried parents, survived one hard financial stretch when my promotion stalled and our son needed speech therapy we had not planned for, and made it through the ordinary erosion of spontaneity that happens when 2 adults become useful to too many people at once. That matters because betrayal lands differently when it enters something that was once honest enough to deserve your faith. You are not just losing a person. You are watching a real structure get repurposed into cover for someone else's self-flattering decisions. If I'm going to tell this story with any integrity, I have to say something about myself that does not flatter me. I was too proud of being the dependable one. Not in a loud way. Quietly. The kind of masculine pride that hides inside usefulness and calls itself humility. I handled the taxes, the emergency fund, the college accounts, the insurance reviews, the car maintenance, the home repair calendar, the retirement transfers, the file cabinet, the quiet machinery of adult life that keeps a household from dissolving into preventable stress. I did those things because I was good at them and because someone had to. But if you do that long enough and well enough, the other person can stop seeing your steadiness as a choice and start experiencing it as weather. Then, if she grows restless, she may begin resenting the very climate she once called safety. Allison used to call me grounding. Later she called me safe. Later than that, her language shifted into something more polished and more dangerous. I became predictable. Structured. A little too comfortable in routine. Those phrases sound harmless in isolation. They are not harmless when they begin moving in one emotional direction for years. They become a taxonomy, a ranking system. Once one spouse starts regarding the other's steadiness as proof of smaller emotional range, betrayal becomes easier to narrate as awakening. The other man entered our life through work, which is as ordinary and unimpressive as these stories usually are when stripped of their emotional fog. His name was Lucas. He was a real estate developer tied to a high-end residential project Allison's firm had been chasing. I met him once at a client dinner. He was the sort of man people often mistake for substance because he had mastered the posture of ease. Good watch. Good voice. Too relaxed to look hungry. The kind of man who lets other people do the admiring for him because they think his calmness means there must be depth somewhere underneath it. Allison described him later as a little too smooth, which in retrospect was exactly the kind of line people use when they are already interested and want to sound objective. I noticed the name before I admitted the significance. More mentions. More late planning sessions. More dinners that somehow produced emotional brightness instead of fatigue. More phone privacy. Not in the childish sense, but in the adult sense. Managed. Softened. Carried room to room. Screen turned slightly away without obvious hiding. I noticed all of that. What I failed to do was trust my own sequence fast enough. I kept trying to preserve dignity by waiting until the evidence would feel undeniable even to a man trying not to become suspicious too early. That was my mistake. Decency is admirable. It is not always efficient. The first time Allison said she had outgrown something in our life, I assumed she meant routine. We were in the kitchen. The kids were out. She had come home late from what she called a sight dinner and still carried that specific brightness people bring home when some part of themselves has been fed elsewhere. I asked whether everything was all right between us. She leaned against the counter, crossed her arms, and said, "I think I've outgrown the version of myself that only knows how to be responsible." That line bothered me for days, not because it was incomprehensible, but because it revealed a hierarchy she had been building quietly for longer than I knew. In her mind, responsibility had become reduction. In other words, the life we built together was no longer being judged by whether it was honest, healthy, or durable. It was being judged by whether it still flattered her appetite for expansion. I should have recognized then that another person was already attached to the sentence. I didn't. Not fully. I kept thinking we were still in the part of a marriage where truth would arrive before collapse if I asked carefully enough. When the affair itself became undeniable, it was not through one dramatic event. It was through a series of ordinary humiliations that finally formed a clean line. A hotel charge on the joint card that didn't match the event location she described. A calendar overlap. A forwarded restaurant confirmation. One rideshare receipt to a condo building I later learned belonged to Lucas. None of those things alone would have created the whole shape. Together they did. By the time I confronted her, I was no longer asking whether there was another man. I was asking whether she still intended to insult both of us by pretending the pattern meant less than it did. Her confession was not brave. It was edited. She said she had developed feelings, that she had not meant for it to happen. That Lucas made her feel more alive. That she loved me, but not in the same way anymore. That phrase, more alive, was one of her favorites in those months, and I've learned to distrust it deeply when spoken by adults in morally compromised situations. A lot of selfish people use alive to describe any feeling intense enough to excuse what they already want to do. I remember asking, "Are you leaving the marriage, or are you just trying to make me bless your way out of it?" She looked hurt by the question, which told me even then that she still wanted innocence more than honesty. "I'm choosing myself," she said. No. She was choosing a flattering story in which desire sounded like courage, and the husband who had carried the structure of the family became evidence of everything she was supposedly outgrowing. That difference mattered to me more than she understood, because I did not object to being left on the grounds of brute honesty. I objected to being recast as a smaller life in order to make her choice look noble. The divorce began before the papers did. That is another truth people often miss. By the time someone says out loud that they are leaving, They have usually already begun relocating their emotional and moral furniture. They start telling friends selective versions of the story. They start describing you in categories that make their future behavior feel understandable. They start acting as though the marriage is already a closed chapter while still sleeping inside the house it built. That happened with Allison too. I heard it in the way mutual acquaintances started asking whether I was doing okay, with a tone that suggested they had already been told I was rigid, emotionally withdrawn, somehow responsible for the atmosphere that justified her departure. I did not fight publicly. That was partly principle and partly strategy. I had children, and more than that, I had standards. I was not going to turn my pain into a social campaign simply because she had begun doing exactly that in gentler language. What I did do was get very quiet. Not wounded silence. Deliberate silence. I met with an attorney, organized the accounts, protected the college funds, reviewed the house valuation, drew up the sequence. If she was going to leave, then the thing she had mistaken for passivity, my steadiness, was going to become the one place in the entire process where performance no longer mattered. That is what people like Allison often fail to understand. They think the calm spouse is weakest right at the point of betrayal because he is the one losing the relationship. They do not realize that once the relationship is no longer morally intact, the calm spouse often becomes the only adult in the room still capable of structure. She moved out 3 weeks later. Not directly into Lucas's house at first, at least not in the public version. Into a temporary condo. A transition period. Space to think. Emotional honesty. All the usual phrases. But I already knew enough to understand what those phrases were doing. They were not describing reality. They were softening sequence. Lucas was not a possibility she was exploring from a distance. He was the reason the distance existed. My daughter saw through it faster than I expected. She came home one weekend from school and sat with me on the patio after dinner. She was 19 then, old enough to notice not just behavior but its moral framing. At one point she said, "Mom keeps talking like she left because she needed a bigger life, but it sounds more like she needed a different audience." That line stayed with me because it was precise in a way many adults fail to be. A different audience. Exactly. Lucas did not represent some hidden truth about Allison. He represented a reflected version of herself she preferred. He saw her as vivid, trapped, underappreciated, expansive. I had seen her as beloved, complicated, talented, flawed, and real. One version flatters. The other requires character. For a while, it seemed as though the affair might survive the transition into daylight. That is the phase that often confuses outsiders and humiliates betrayed spouses most. Everyone watches to see whether the new relationship flourishes, as if that will retroactively determine whether the betrayal meant something profound. It won't. The durability of a second relationship does not tell you whether it was right. It tells you only whether two selfish people can endure ordinary life once the contrast that made them exciting is gone. And that was exactly the problem. Lucas was impressive in stolen hours. He was much less impressive in routine. That is the trouble with people who are chosen as symbols rather than known as humans. Once the symbol has to start carrying actual life, its weaknesses become expensive. Lucas was generous when generosity looked like a gesture. He was less generous when money became sequencing rather than display. He was attentive when attention was contrast. Less attentive when it became maintenance. He understood Allison brilliantly as long as understanding meant. Reflecting her back to herself in flattering light. Once understanding required responsibility, patience, and the willingness to be inconvenienced by another person's full emotional weather, his brilliance thinned quickly. The first sign of fracture came through money. Not mine. Theirs. A mutual acquaintance mentioned offhandedly that Lucas had delayed a purchase tied to one of his projects because some financing had become messier than expected. That interested me because men like Lucas often perform solidity more elegantly than they live it. Then I learned from a neighbor who had no idea how much the comment meant that Allison had suddenly pulled back from a planned trip and was under a lot of stress right now. That phrase, under a lot of stress, usually means reality has begun imposing costs on what was previously sustained by adrenaline. Still, I did not make much of it outwardly. That is important. I did not sit around waiting for her life to fail. Whatever satisfaction a smaller man might take from that, I did not have room for it. I was too busy rebuilding a stable reality for myself and my children. But I noticed. And I noticed because I finally understood what the affair had really been built on: asymmetry. She had chosen him not because he was stronger, wiser, or more durable than I was, but because he allowed her to confuse intensity with depth. Then he left her too. Not in a dramatic explosion. More quietly than that. Which, in a way, was more humiliating for her and more illuminating for me. He did what many people of his type do once the secondary relationship loses its contrast and starts asking to become a real life. He withdrew. Became less available. More complicated. More focused on his own pressures, his own timing, his own need for room. In other words, he became exactly the kind of person I suspect he had always been. Only now there was no husband in the background carrying the moral and practical structure of her life while she admired him. I found out through her, though not because she intended to tell me in any morally satisfying way. We were in a parking lot outside a college financial aid meeting for our son. Divorce has a way of forcing certain contacts long after emotional trust is gone. She looked thinner, more controlled than calm, and there was a brittleness in her tone I had not heard before. At one point, after an awkward conversation about tuition logistics, she said, almost to herself, "I guess not everyone stays." That line would have sounded cryptic to anyone else. To me, it was immediately obvious. I asked, "Did he leave?" She looked at me and, for the first time in a very long while, there was no superiority in the gaze. No flattering narrative. Just fatigue. "He said he wasn't built for this kind of pressure," she said. That sentence told me everything. Not only that Lucas had left, but that the very quality she had once reinterpreted in me as limitation, the ability to stay, to carry, to endure pressure without needing the room to admire me for it, had been the thing she misunderstood most profoundly. I did not comfort her. I did not mock her either. Both would have been performances of a kind. I simply said, "No. He was built for being chosen. That's different. That was not revenge. It was accuracy. And accuracy, once it arrives cleanly, is often colder and more useful than emotion." The turning point in the story, if it can be called one, was not his departure itself. It was what his departure revealed about the entire structure of her choice. She had not chosen some higher form of love. She had chosen a mirror. A man who reflected a version of herself she wanted to believe in, and who was only willing to do so as long as the lighting remained favorable. Once life stopped flattering the arrangement, he withdrew. That is what exposed the real hierarchy she had misread. I was not the lesser man because I stayed. He was not the greater man because he dazzled. The truth was simpler and less romantic than that. One of us understood the cost of real life. The other understood the aesthetics of escape. By then, of course, the marriage was long over. I was not waiting in the wings for revelation to bring her back to me, and I would have been ashamed of myself if I had been. The purpose of truth is not always restoration. Sometimes it is only clarification. The clarification, in this case, was complete. She had misjudged us both. She had mistaken my steadiness for limitation and his intensity for strength. In reality, my steadiness had been one of the strongest things in her life, and his intensity had been one of the weakest. The divorce finalized a few months later. Quietly. Expensively. With the usual paperwork, valuations, account divisions, and carefully civil meetings children should never have to know exist. Our daughter became politely distant with her mother for a long time. Our son learned, much too early, that adults often use beautiful language to decorate ugly choices. I rebuilt my life in the plain way serious men usually do, through routine, work, fatherhood, and the slow recovery of self-respect that comes not from pretending you are untouched, but from refusing to let injury become your identity. About a year later, Allison said something to me while we were waiting outside our son's graduation venue. I really thought he was different. I looked at her and said, "No, you thought he was different from me. That's not the same thing." That, I think, is the message worth carrying from what happened to me. People who leave for excitement often believe they are choosing depth over safety, truth over routine, aliveness over stagnation. Sometimes they are simply choosing the person least burdened by reality at that moment. There is a difference. A man who looks freer is not necessarily stronger. A man who speaks more boldly is not necessarily more honest. And the spouse who stays steady under pressure is not lesser because he makes real life look ordinary. Often he is the only one in the story who understood what real life costs. If there is anything worth understanding from my story, it is this. Being chosen second by someone chasing illusion is not proof that you were less. It may simply mean you were too real to keep flattering the fantasy they wanted to live inside. And when the fantasy fails, as fantasies so often do, the truth it reveals is not that you should feel vindicated. It is that arrogance does not only destroy loyalty, it destroys judgment. My wife chose him over me. Then he left her too. And in the end, what collapsed was not just their affair. It was the entire false hierarchy she had built to justify it.